Some things a man keeps in his teeth. The fire had been out for an hour. The east wall of my hay barn was nothing but ash and blackened timber hissing in the snow. Nora had worked the bucket line until her hands quit. I brought her inside. She stood by the iron stove, back to me. I crossed the room, meaning only to check her hands. Cold like, that can kill flesh. I took them without asking. Her skin was raw, beef red, cracked at the knuckles. I worked the blood back into her fingers slow, thumb pressing deep into the palms, rolling the stiffness out like you'd warm a frozen bridle before a hard ride. Deliberate, careful, too careful. Then she looked up. The lamp behind her threw a low, dirty light across her face. Her hair had come half loose in the chaos. Dark strands stuck to the sweat on her neck. She still smelled of smoke and kerosene and woman. The space between us had shrunk to nothing, less than a forearm, close enough I could see the pulse beating hard under the thin skin of her throat. My hands were still holding hers. Her breath hitched once. Mine did too. I said her name, low and rough, like it hurt coming out. For half a second, the whole world narrowed to the heat of her skin, the smell of her hair, and the way her lips parted just a fraction. Then reality came back like a bucket of creek water to the face. But I'm getting ahead of myself, stranger. The third cylinder was stiff with carbon. That morning, I finally sat down with a horseshoe nail and worked it loose while the chicory came to a boil on the stove. Coffee that tasted like bark. A colt that needed cleaning. A silence that had been sitting in that cabin for 9 years and had started to feel like furniture. I lived at Kettle Bluff because that was where the horse died. $30 in 2 days was all she had left in her. In Boise City, they didn't call me by name. I'd heard what they called me. The man at Kettle Bluff. The one who shot 3 men at Dry Creek Crossing and left the badges behind. The badges were in a tobacco tin, under the floorboard by the east wall. I hadn't looked at them in 6 years. Not since the night I put down a man I thought was an armed road agent and walked up to the body in the dark and found a pick handle, not a gun, and a face I didn't recognize, which was somehow worse than if I had. I flinched when lamplight caught the edge of a belt buckle wrong. I kept my left hand in my coat pocket when I walked through town so nobody offered to shake it. I didn't know yet that Silas Vane had already made his last arrangement, that he'd sent his daughter to collect on a debt I hadn't known I owed. I pulled the cinch tight until the roan grunted and stamped, then heard the sound on the road. Footsteps. Not a horse. Footsteps. She came around the bend in the gray afternoon light, walking the wagon road from the direction of Callow Creek Crossing. No animal, no trunk. A wool shawl, the color of river mud, pulled tight at her shoulders, and in her right hand, pressed flat against her sternum, like she was keeping her ribs from separating, a sheet of paper folded into quarters. I stood at the side of the barn and did not move. She stopped at the base of my porch steps. Brown hair pinned back without ceremony. Her left boot was worn down to bare leather at the heel. Her eyes were dry, not red, not swollen, fixed on me with the steadiness of someone who has already cried everything they had and replaced it with something harder. She opened her mouth, closed it, swallowed. Then she looked down at the porch boards. My father said you needed a wife. The aspen leaves moved. I set down the hoofpick. Might as well be you. Her head came up so fast the shawl nearly went with it. Her jaw worked once without producing a sound. She held out the folded paper. I crossed the porch and took it. Silas's handwriting. I knew it from his field notes, cramped and deliberate, the letters leaning hard to the right, like they were braced against a headwind. Nora is too proud to ask for help, and too good to need it. Circumstances have made liars of better people. I have told her to go to you. I know what I am asking. I know what you are. Look after her. That is all. SV. I folded the paper along its original creases. I looked out at the canyon ridge. A hawk made slow circles above the red rock, without any apparent urgency. I thought that was about right. Your father, I said, carried me 8 miles through Bannock country, with an arrow in my shoulder. Did it in the dark? Did it in the rain? Sat with me 2 nights after, when the fever was bad, never asked for a thing. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't tell me that. He wouldn't. I looked at her then. How long before the boarding house puts you out? 4 days. Any family in the territory? She shook her head. Come inside, Miss Vane. The wind's picking up. I boiled crushed chicory and poured it into the only 2 cups I owned. 1 iron, 1 crockery, with a hairline crack down the side. I gave her the iron one. She sat across the table and studied the grain of the wood while I laid it out plain. The land was more than one man could work through winter. The garden had gone to half yield for lack of attention. I couldn't keep the accounts and the horses and the fencing in any kind of order at the same time. A civil ceremony, nothing romantic about it, before the circuit judge when he came through Thursday. She'd have her own space, her own legal standing on the property. In return, she ran the household and kept the books. People will talk, she said. They do that anyway. Don't change the weather. She looked at me directly. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know your father. Her jaw tightened. She gave one slow nod. Thursday came cold. I shaved. Found a dark wool shirt in the trunk. My mother's choice, kept for Sundays I no longer observed. I looked like what I was. She was already at the fence when I came out. A dress the color of winter sage, small pearl buttons down the front that caught the pale morning light. Her hair pinned differently, loose at the back. She stood with her hands at her sides in the cold air, and her spine absolutely straight. I said, You look well. She glanced down at the dress. It was my mother's, the only good thing I brought. It's enough, I said. The ceremony lasted 9 minutes. The circuit judge, Aldous Crane, a man who'd signed 50 such documents and found them all equally routine, received us in the back room of the Boise City Land Office. One witness, a trapper named Fen Taggart, who agreed to put his name on our paper, for 2 bits and a cup of coffee. When Crane said the matter was settled, Nora looked at me and I looked at Nora. I was working the creekside fencing when I heard the buggy on the canyon road. Black lacquer, a matched pair of bays, absurdly out of place on that road in December. Her husband Gerald had run the largest cattle operation north of Callow Creek. When he died, she'd taken over with an efficiency most men grudgingly acknowledged and privately feared. She'd made 3 offers on my land. I'd declined each one. What she wanted wasn't the cabin or the canyon. It was the creek, the only reliable water source within 6 miles. She understood that. She'd understood it before Gerald was cold. She stepped down from the buggy in dark wool and silver jewelry and smiled the way people smile when they believe they've already won. Nora opened the door before I reached the porch. Cresswell looked her over, from the hairpins to the work-worn boots, slowly and without hurry, the way you appraise a horse you're considering, but not seriously. You must be the new arrangement, she said. Nora opened the door wider. Come in. We just made coffee. I came around the side of the cabin, and Cresswell turned to me with the same composed expression. Mr. Hargrove, I heard you'd taken a wife under rather peculiar circumstances. Circumstances were straightforward. I'm sure they were. She let that sit a moment. Then, I wonder if you're aware that the Boise River Cattle Association has documented a prior claim to redirect the upper branch of Callow Creek. Predates your deed by 11 years. Legal process could take, well, it could take everything you have. It was a lie. She knew I knew it. I'll take it up with the association, I said. Or, she said pleasantly, you could sell to me. Fair market price. Start somewhere, without complications. Nora stepped forward. Her voice was quiet and level, the way water is level in a glass you're trying not to spill. Thank you for the visit, Mrs. Cresswell. The road back to town is easier before dark. Cresswell paused at the buggy step. Addressed me as though Nora weren't standing right there. She's got grit, Hargrove. Won't save her. She drove away. I stood in the cold and watched until the buggy rounded the bend. Beside me, Nora watched too. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not hugging herself, the posture of someone calculating. She'll come back, Nora said. Yes. Not with lawyers. I looked at her. She was still watching the empty road. No, I said. Not with lawyers. I smelled it before I woke fully. Not wood smoke from the stove. Something larger. Something being consumed that had no business burning. I was outside in 30 seconds with my coat half buttoned and the Winchester in my right hand. The east wall of the hay barn was already gone. Flames moving up what remained of the timber framing with a lazy, confident speed. At the base of the wall, where the snow met the siding, a chemical sharpness cut through the smoke. Kerosene. I shouted once toward the cabin and ran for the pump. Nora came through the door before I'd primed the handle. No coat. A wool blanket over her shoulders and a bucket in each hand. She'd filled the second one at the rain barrel before I got the pump working. We worked an hour in the freezing dark. She ran the line. I worked the pump. Neither of us spoke. We saved the frame. The east wall was gone. The hay inside was ash. When the last flame died, we stood in the snow and looked at what remained. Her hands had gone the dark red of cold cracked leather, the skin splitting at the knuckles. I found her coat where she'd dropped it on the porch steps and put it around her shoulders. She didn't thank me. She did this, she said. Not a question. I crouched and looked at the ground where the fire had started. The snow in a 4-foot radius had the unmistakable mineral bite of accelerant. 20 yards out, half buried, a tin canteen with a stamped letter C on the body. There's a man named Decker, I said. Runs errands for the Cresswell operation. Been in front of the sheriff twice. Can you prove it? Canteen. The pour line in the snow. Direction of the boot tracks. I stood up. It's enough for Maddox to ask the question. Decker won't hold under questioning. He's not built for it. She pulled the coat tighter. I'll ride with you. At first light. Inside, I got the lamp lit and checked her hands properly. She stood by the stove without speaking. Her hair had come half loose in the work. The smoke smell was deep in the wool of her dress, and the lamp put a low amber light across the side of her face. I took her hands in mine. Cold that deep has a particular texture. Not just temperature, but density. Like the tissue has begun to stiffen around itself. I worked my thumbs along her palm, in slow even strokes, the way you'd work warmth back into a saddle-sore muscle before a cold morning ride. She looked down at her hands. Not at me. The lamp flickered once and steadied. My hands were not gentle things. 38 years of rope work and iron work had left them calloused. Hers were smaller than I'd registered before, and rougher than you'd expect. There was a callus at the base of her right index finger from the account book pen. I did not mean to notice it. She looked up anyway. The distance was what it was, less than a forearm's length, the way it gets in a one-room cabin in winter when there is only one lamp and one stove, and the cold presses in from every wall. Her eyes in that light were dark and entirely still. "Nora?" She pulled her hands back slowly. Not fast, not afraid. The way you close a door you intend to open again when the time is right. "At first light," she said. She turned and went to her side of the cabin. I sat in the chair by the stove and fed small pieces of split pine into the firebox, one at a time, and did not sleep until the lamp burned out. Sheriff Cole Maddox was not a quick-moving man. He was a methodical one. There's a difference, and on the frontier, the difference matters. I laid it out for him at the office on Broad Street. Before 7 in the morning, the kerosene smell, the pour line, the canteen, the boot tracks running north-northeast toward the Cresswell upper pasture. He listened with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on the middle distance. When I finished, he stood up, pulled his coat off the peg, and said, "Let's find Decker." Decker was at the Continental's saloon. A man drinking before 8 in the morning had something on his conscience, or nothing left to lose, and Decker didn't strike me as the second kind. Maddox was thorough, and most people, given enough silence and enough time, will fill it themselves. By noon, Decker had given a full statement. $40. That was the price Miriam Cresswell had put on my hay barn. $40 to walk up to a man's property in the dark with a can of kerosene and take from him the one thing he couldn't easily replace before winter. While I was with Maddox, Nora had gone to the land office. She hadn't told me she was going. I found out from Fen Taggart when I came out of the saloon. She'd requested copies of every recorded deed and water right document associated with our property and the Cresswell holdings going back 20 years. That night, she spread them across the table without ceremony and went through them the way a surgeon goes through an incision. Clean, direct, no wasted movement. I drank coffee and stayed out of her way. "Here," she said, 3 discrepancies in the Cresswell boundary survey. Survey markers placed on the wrong side of a geological feature. An easement claimed over land deeded to a third party 11 years prior and never legally reverted. A water right filing dated 2 months after the legal window had closed. "Where'd you learn to read survey documents?" I said. She didn't look up from the papers. "Father made me copy legal filings for handwriting practice when I was 12. Said a woman who could read a contract was harder to cheat than one who couldn't." I looked at the documents she'd laid out in order. At the letter in her careful, precise hand, already drafted to the Territorial Land Commissioner. I thought about Silas Vane, walking 8 miles in the dark with my dead weight across his shoulders. I watched her hand on the pen a moment. He knew what he was about. She set down the pen. Something moved across her face. Grief, and then something on the other side of grief that I didn't have a name for. "Almost," she said. "He said you needed a wife." A pause. "I think he was only half right about what you needed." I didn't answer that. I picked up my coffee. Outside, the wind worked at the shutter latch, and the shutter held. The news moved through Boise City in 2 days. The Cattle Association quietly withdrew their endorsement of the Cresswell water claim. The Land Commissioner's office responded to Nora's letter inside a week. 3 discrepancies confirmed. Survey, pending correction. Miriam Cresswell sold her ranch in March. She left the territory without announcement. No one in Boise City organized a farewell. I rebuilt the east wall in February using canyon timber hauled down on the Rhone through fetlock-deep mud. Nora painted it without being asked. Red ochre wash, the kind the Bannock used on lodgepole. It dried darker than I expected, the color of old brick, or dried blood, or the canyon walls in the last light of afternoon. "Looks different," I told her. "Looks better," she said. I did not argue. Spring came late that year, and all at once. The creek ran fast with snowmelt. The garden broke ground in the last week of March, and the first green pulled up through the Idaho soil. One morning I was mending the south fence line when Nora came across the field with 2 cups of chicory coffee. She handed me the iron one and stood beside me without speaking, and we watched the canyon rim turn gold as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Neither of us had anything that needed saying. I set down my cup on the fence post. "Nora." "Yeah. I think your father knew this would happen." She was quiet a moment, turned the crockery cup in both hands. "He always knew things before other people did," she said. "It was annoying, mostly." I looked at the fence post, at the wood grain in it. I set down my cup. "Nora." "Yeah. I reckon I love you." She turned the cup slow in her hands. "I know it," she said. "Reckon I love you too. I'd like to hear it every day." "Then you will." We went back to work. By noon, the south line was solid. There was salt pork and cold biscuit for lunch, and we ate it standing in the field, because neither of us wanted to go inside yet. That summer, the garden fed half the neighbors through a dry August. Nora organized a barn dance on the first Saturday of June, in the barn with the new east wall and the red ochre paint that had dried the color of the canyon at dusk. Somewhere in there, without either of us deciding to allow it, the man they called the man at Kettle Bluff stopped being a man people were careful around. I still kept the tobacco tin under the floorboard, but I didn't flinch when lamplight caught a belt buckle wrong anymore. Silas Vane had known what he was doing, made his arrangement from a sickbed with fever in his blood, and trusted the rest would work itself out. The cattle still needed feeding, and the land, hard as it was, left us a place to stand. She saved that land as much as I did, maybe more, and the soil didn't thank either one of us. The law didn't either. So I ask you, stranger, if it was your land, your deed, your name on that paper, and everything you'd built was being taken one piece at a time by someone with more lawyers and less conscience, would you have held the line? Or would you have sold and called it sense?